All right. So we're underway. We're now going to establish South Carolina, and let me give the world, because the haircut is going away. I wasn't planning to record this tearful moment, but because my wife has scheduled a haircut for me later today, I'll let the world see the asymmetrical rear perspective of Dr. Ramsey. Well, we left off with the Westos. You guys speculated about what you might have done if you were in the shoes of the Westo Indians. We walked all the way from upstate New York down through Virginia and camped on the Savannah River near Augusta, what we now call Augusta, Georgia, and had a chance to live a happy life and make new friends and farm without fear of constant Iroquois attacks. And instead, they chose to pioneer the Indian slave trade and attack all of their new neighbors with the firearms they had acquired. So in the process, they became a little bit pathological. I don't think I'm being unfair to the Westos, and we'll have someone visit their town just to confirm that they were a little bit unusual in just a moment. But compounding that new development, the Westos ran amok in the South for about 10 years until the arrival of maybe 15 years, I would say, maybe even a full 2 decades until the arrival of the English at Carolina to establish Charlestown. So that's one of our destinations for the day. And I've put up here a little bit of colonial context, what was taking place as Carolina was in the formative stages and planning stages. Virginia was the first English colony in 1607. The Westos had had a little brush with Virginia, and they learned how to capture Indians and sell them to the tobacco planters for guns and ammunition and money up there in Virginia. So Virginia was the first in 1607, then Plymouth, Barbados, and that one, in fact, you'll see, turns out to be pretty important for the Carolina project. In fact, some historians refer to Carolina as the colony of a colony. Early expeditions were organized out of Barbados, and the early settlers were coming from Barbados, and there are some important implications that stem from that relationship. Hopefully, I'll have the presence of mind to remind us of those when we get there. The famous Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, and ultimately Carolina. Not North and South yet. It was all one colony, Carolina. With charters, the king drew the charters all the way to the Pacific Ocean. No one knew where the heck the Pacific Ocean was, but they just had those lines going west until they hit water. But the actual date of settlement, 1670 there. But a good deal of planning took place prior to that. Carolina, that's the actual seal. There's a copy of this over in the Charleston Museum. Wax seal still, a few of them still survives. The actual image, seal of the colony of Carolina. It was known as is known as a restoration colony. That's a little different from some of the other colonies that we just looked at. Do you know what was being restored? Why is it called a restoration colony? I think there's a restoration hardware. There used to be in the malls when we still had malls back during the days of civilized retail. I don't have my glasses on, so I can't see. Looking for someone who appears to know but doesn't want to raise their hand. I suspect, as upper division students, you probably know, but this is the restoration of the monarchy. And that tells, that's a big part of Carolina's story. There is the monarch being restored, Charles II. Do you remember what happened to his dad? He was indeed. Yeah, they chased him down and cut his head off. And for about 10 years, I think he was beheaded around 1649. For about 10 years, you probably know this history as well, there was no king in England. It was the Commonwealth. The parliamentarians, the Roundheads, had won that civil war, and they governed without a monarch. Oliver Cromwell was the Lord Protector, kind of the executive, but there was no monarch. And the British, really enjoyed their royal families and that sort of thing. So they started missing having a king, and eventually brought Charles II back. But as you might suspect, Charles II was never 100% comfortable on the throne, knowing what had happened to his daddy. He knew things could go off the rails. They weren't very, very careful. So he tried his best to surround himself with people he could really, really trust. And some of the Carolina founders are right next to him on this horse. George Carteret is the long-haired gentleman right here, and a little bit farther back, if you're from Monk's Corner, George Monk is a little farther back. My image crops off the entire painting of the king's retinue. This is him. He had been in exile for a couple of years and was now riding back into London at the invitation of Parliament to assume the throne, the restoration of the monarchy, the king. And of course, he's got some weapons there. He wants his closest friends right next to him with weapons as he rides into the exact city that beheaded. There is actually a tourist location where the king's head fell and where he gave his famous speech. It was one of those really moving last word type of things. But he's got all of his top supporters, and to make sure that they kept supporting him, he gave away a lot of stuff. Some of it was not even his, like Dutch New Netherland. It's not part of our story, but he gave his little brother, who could potentially try to oust him and take the throne himself. He gave his younger brother, the Duke of York, the Dutch colony of New Netherland. The Dutch were shocked. There are a few others. Originally New Netherland, but once the Duke of York, and he gave him also, made him Lord High Admiral of the Navy, control of the Navy. So he gave him Dutch New Netherland and the ability to go invade New Netherland with the Navy and take it away from the Dutch, which he did and named it after a great deal of soul searching after himself. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and a lot of the names we're about to see, you don't feel like you need to write all of these guys down. I'm going to show you the Lords Proprietors of Carolina, but they had their fingers in just about every pie. The king wanted his supporters to be loyal, and he gave them, the top people gave them lots of stuff. So the New Jersey proprietors are basically the Carolina proprietors too. Then as now, well, I won't make a commentary on economics, but Bernie Sanders probably would have had something to say about all of this interconnected profiteering that was taking place at the time. There they are. You don't have to write every single one of these down or memorize them. I'm not going to test you on what their individual names were, but it could be of interest for your research or down the line if you're a teacher anticipating in 3rd and 6th grade teaching this kind of stuff. I'm just going to focus on a couple to make a simple point, which is that all of these guys were really big-time movers and shakers. They were proprietors of other colonies. In charge of the treasury, privy council members, all kinds of stuff. Can I go forward, or do you want to write more? Just a couple of quick biographical sketches with that very simple point. These guys were given lots of presents by Charles II. Were not just proprietors of Carolina, but involved in lots of other things. There is the long-haired gentleman walking alongside Charles II on his re-entry to London, George Carteret. He was a member of the Privy Council. That was the King's Council. Anyone who was a member was extremely important because they could access the king's ear. If you had any kind of legal complaint or policy concern, you could speak to one of those Privy Council members and have it presented directly to the king, which was an incredible power. Treasurer of the Navy, so he was sitting down at the table with Duke of York, Lord High Admiral of the Navy, talking about all of these kinds of things. Vice Treasurer of Ireland, and anyone who was a treasurer of anything or vice treasurer in these days had the opportunity to really skim off some serious profits from taxes and funds that were difficult for the public to track. So it was a huge financial benefit, proprietor of New Jersey as well. Just a couple more of the proprietors, but like I said, the point is very simple. They were just really well-connected and high-positioned individuals who the king wanted to keep in his circle of loyalty. So he gave them jobs, colonies, etc., titles. The river is named after Anthony Ashley Cooper, Cooper River down at the Low Country. Earl of Shaftesbury was Chancellor of the Exchequer, one of the Lords of Trade, and he was the one who took it upon himself to draft the Colonial Constitution, the fundamental. It's not a very catchy title, but it's the early Carolina Constitution, the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, which was a rather clunky document. He spent a lot of time thinking about it, and significantly enough, if you're interested in constitutional issues, his personal secretary was John Locke, a man who inspired many American revolutionaries. And Locke developed some of his thinking as he was working out the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. One interesting feature, couple I'll show you, of the Constitution was they had some level of religious toleration. They wanted to try and attract settlers to Carolina, so the Constitution did protect some measure of religious liberty. But one of the most curious aspects of it was they were hoping, when they dreamed of what they would create in Carolina, they were hoping to recreate an almost medieval social order. A lot of these guys were from aristocratic families, and even though they were doing well thanks to Charles II's largesse during the Restoration, a lot of those aristocratic families were not what they had once been due to the early stages of the capitalist transformation. Textile industries and so on. New wealth was coming along that challenged some of the old social order. So one thing they were hoping to do was recapture those ancient times where the landowners were at the top of a feudal order. There weren't a bunch of troublesome merchants, up-and-coming merchants acting like they were the equals of the old blue blood. So they created a caste system, a social system with titles based on landed wealth. Those are at the top, Lord Palatine. I have not been able to identify how much. I think for virtually all of Carolina entitles you to be Lord Palatine. 48,000 acres, and you can call yourself a landgrave. And there's the cacique. We talked about the cacica of Cofitacheki that you could be referred to. And everyone in Carolina, they imagined it this way. It didn't actually play out. Nobody paid any attention to this in real life once Carolina got underway. But in their thinking, if you had the 24 acres, your social inferiors would have to preface your name with cacique, Cacique Ramsey, or else you had real grounds for, issuing them a citation or having somebody issue them a citation for that kind of disrespect. That's, to my mind, I've got a half acre over in Center Court subdivision, 48,000 acres. Boy, you could really ramble about a state like that. And they hope to get rich in part by what were called quit rents. This one is from a little bit later in time, but they themselves didn't need the 48,000 acres, and some of those lords proprietors claimed far more than that. But they anticipated ordinary settlers coming in and establishing estates, farms, etc., and paying them what was called a quit rent every year. This one is a 4-pounder, 4 pounds, some number of shillings. Can't tell. Which is not inexpensive. It's a moderate thing. It's almost like the taxes, property taxes we pay, much less than we pay in Greenwood County. But they anticipated that if there were enough settlers, then they might make some pretty good money off of just the permission to live on their land. So they would retain ownership, make quit rents. And again, that one didn't turn out to work. That one didn't work as they were hoping either, because people just went out and lived on the land and never sent anything to the lord's proprietors. And the lord proprietors had no way of verifying who was out there. In most cases, none of them ever came. They observed all of this from the mother country. I don't think a single lord's proprietor ever set foot. A descendant maybe, but not the original crew. Well, here's the Barbados connection. John Colleton. There's his biography as well. Yet another lord's proprietor with a lot of connections, who was gifted by Charles II for his loyalty. In fact, he was so loyal to the monarchy, he actually had to run away from the Roundheads. He settled in Barbados. He was there when Barbados made the transition to sugarcane. Enormously profitable crop. And along with the conversion to sugarcane, the conversion to life-term slavery as a labor system, with Africans brought in by the Royal African Company. And there you see the Royal African Company. That is the royal monopoly on the awful trade in human souls from the coast of Africa into the Caribbean principally, and then to other locations as well. And that's one of the significant parts of the Barbados connection. Barbados turned out to be the staging ground for early explorations because it was so tiny. There it is, right behind my haircut there. Probably, it's a little speck. We'll see it in just a moment. Way out here, it's the farthest east, or windward. It's the first, they're the first to receive those incoming trade winds. But can I go forward? I still see a little bit of writing. You want me to pause a moment? I hesitate to speculate on the width of Barbados without my next map that tells me precisely. But you could fit Barbados easily between Abbeville and Greenwood. It's a small, small island. And as a result, because every inch was planted in sugarcane, there were a lot of settlers who were looking for some other place to go, a place to set up shop, and Carolina was the #1 option coming out of the 1660s. So they organized some reconnaissance expeditions. There is Barbados. It looks like maybe 4 miles wide at its widest point. So from that little speck in the Caribbean, they set forth. William Hilton, I've already mentioned him, but let's see if we can pinpoint. There's roughly Hilton Head. That's one of the places he put in, searching for a likely place to establish a new colony, early 1660s. And he encountered a unique ecology, one thing that we don't see nowadays that was conspicuous to William Hilton. He wrote about it and commented that the forest just seemed so colorful and in constant motion to him because of the Carolina parakeet, or Carolina parrot. Maybe a 10-inch long tropical type bird with these colorings. It was everywhere in the low country. Thousands and thousands. If you were to come ashore with William Hilton, you would see all of those oak canopies crowded with these colorful birds, thousands of them. So plentiful, William Hilton said, that he could take ashore a blunderbuss, kind of a sawed-off shotgun that fired off small caliber birdshot, and just point it up in the tree and blast away, and enough for, several men to eat dinner would just tumble out of the branches. And I think the last one, they're extinct now, but the last one was seen sometime around the Civil War. Overhunting was certainly one of the likeliest causes because they were quite visible. They had no camouflage. They were very, very conspicuous and easy to bring down. There's a little bit of flippant humor from Dr. Ramsey. The next expedition was the Sanford Expedition. You guys don't even recognize this guy anymore, do you? One person. This is the former governor. This is Mark Sanford. It's not the guy we're talking about, but I put his picture up there just to be really funny. But Robert Sanford was the leader of this expedition in 1666. Went to the same locations as William Hilton, and they were thinking at that time Port Royal was the likeliest place to establish because it was and is one of the world's great harbors. They made contacts with local Indians, nations all along the coast of Carolina, and then as they were preparing to depart, Sanford thought it might be useful because now they were in a position, had identified the likeliest places to plant the first town in the colony. They were in a position to really make contacts and return with a colonizing expedition. He asked for a volunteer. This guy is one of the most unique and interesting characters in early Carolina history. He asked for a volunteer to stay behind, all by himself, and get to know the Native Americans along the coast. They had selected a tribe, and the tribe agreed to host this individual and learn the languages. And the ship's surgeon, Henry Woodward, held his hand up. It was going to be at least a year or two. Turned out to be 4 before the colonists actually returned, but he volunteered to stay behind, and he did learn the languages. We still have a little bit of his research. He learned how to speak several different coastal languages and was quite fluent, and was a very diplomatic person, apparently. They really came to enjoy his company and value Henry Woodward. He was a reasonable type of person, better than average intelligence, respectful. So he was very welcome and established very good relations and the ability to communicate. And the Spanish were very nervous about it. They came up and captured Henry Woodward, took him down to St. Augustine. This is a very brief synopsis of a life you can't even dream up. They took him back down, threw him in the dungeon at St. Augustine just a couple of months before Sir Francis Drake, I believe it was. Maybe, no, it may have been a different pirate. But St. Augustine was attacked by an English pirate, and they discovered Henry Woodward down there in the dungeon, and they broke him out and started sailing him home and he pointed, no, I need to head back to that coast. So when the Carolinians arrived, he was once again back there on the coast after having spent some time in the Spanish dungeon. And he helped them communicate, establish good relations. He was their go-to person for diplomacy with all of the Indian nations. There's the first location of Charleston. I'm always tempted to say Charleston, but if we were to go back through a time vortex to 1670, it wouldn't work. We'd have to say Charlestown, named after, of course, Charles II. Not where we see it today, but that was the original location, and farther north than Port Royal because they were a little nervous of the Spanish. Having heard Henry Woodward's story about getting scooped up along the coast, they decided to go a little farther north and gain a little distance from St. Augustine. Those are some of the coastal nations. Names we still see attached to some geographical locations. The Edistos, the Stonos, the Etowans, Wandos, the Combis. The Edisto nation, I think, is still there. I tried to go talk to them, and they didn't want to talk to me. But there's a man who claims to be the principal chief, or there was about 15 years ago when I was doing interviews. But most of those coastal nations were decimated over the next few decades for reasons you're about to encounter. And they all told Henry Woodward, they all told the Carolinians about the Westos. That the Westos were a really big problem. They were being hammered by repeated slave raids from the Westos. The Westos would show up, launch a raid, capture their children, their wives, march them up to Virginia and get more guns. And during that, let's see, it was about 3 years, the Carolinians caught sight of some of the Westo warriors skulking about in the woods. And the Westos themselves were curious about Carolina, so they came a little bit closer and indicated they could not speak. Henry Woodward could not speak to the Westos. They were from way, way up north, speaking in an Iroquoian language, so they were a curiosity. But they let it be known through hand gestures that they would be interested in having an emissary sent from Carolina to talk about maybe trade relations or an alliance. And of course, all eyes in Charlestown turned to Henry Woodward. Even though he didn't know this particular language, he was the one who had proven himself capable of going out into Indian country and establishing these types of relations. So he was tapped, and he all by himself. He walked out into the woods. He had a musket with him and some supplies. He walked out there and met 2 Westo warriors a little bit beyond Charlestown, and they turned and led him back through towards their town on the Savannah River. He left a journal, about a 15-page journal of his experiences marching with them. They had left markings on the trees for themselves to identify where various victims were living in the Carolina upcountry. He got to the Savannah River, and his 2 traveling mates, again, everyone communicating with gestures, that kind of thing, and nonverbal communication. When they got within sight of the town, they fired off their guns, and Henry Woodward reported he heard about 60 fired off in return, a salutation, a greeting. So we assume the Westos had in the neighborhood of 60 what were called gunmen, warriors equipped with guns at that stage. And he went right into the center of the town. They lived in the long bark houses that the Iroquois were famous or recognized for. So their architecture was different from anything else in the Southeast. And from the top of each of those long houses, they had hundreds of human scalps draped. That too was not something you would see in any other southern Indian town at the time. So Henry Woodward knew he was unusual location. And they sat down, all the kids, they went to the council house, all the kids climbed up on top of the house and pried the bark and thatch back so they could look down and see the white man down there. And Henry Woodward managed to conclude an alliance. Limited as the language was, that was the understanding. So the Westos, starting in 1674, started bringing their victims to Charlestown. It's an easier journey than going all the way up to Jamestown, Virginia. They would attack the Spanish missions down in Florida. I think there's no clear evidence that he did this, but I'm sure he must have asked them to target non-friends of Carolina, but the Carolinians were not that discriminating. They were willing to purchase. The labor was in such need, they were willing to purchase individuals who had formerly been on good terms with the colony. And that was the case for a good 20 years, and it ultimately led to some unhappy results for Carolina over time. About 6 years that relationship lasted. The Westos never let up. They attacked the Spanish missions. They took women and children, preferably men, if they could, but they brought them back and they were sold in Charlestown as slaves. And the Westos got gunpowder and bullets, bought new guns. But by about 1680, South Carolina, not South yet, but still just Carolina, began to think it could do a little better without having just a single nation as a trade partner. They knew enough by 1680 to suspect there were larger Indian nations a little farther into the interior. They knew about the Cherokees up in the Appalachian Mountains, and they started to want more trade partners. And the Westos, of course, wanted to maintain a monopoly. That's what their power rested on, being the only people with guns, the only Indians with guns in the Southeast. So ultimately, that tension resulted in conflict, what's known as the Westo War, 1681, in which the relationship was broken off. The Westos went after South Carolina, and more often than not, Carolina went after the Westos. It was Carolina that wanted to see other people, as the saying goes. The Westos were trying to prevent that from happening. There are a couple of consequences. Relatively brief war. Devastating for the Westos. They did not survive as a nation. This is their last appearance. You can find refugees for about the next 30 years living with different Indian groups. But as you might suspect, they weren't that welcome. When a Westo warrior or Westo family walked into a village that had been victimized by the Westos previously, they were not always applauded and provided sanctuary. So the Westos had to be very careful who they went to ask for help once they had been shattered as a nation. But there is the first consequence, Charlestown as we know it. Sensing the danger of Westo attacks, Carolinians pulled up stakes from the west side of the Ashley River and moved up where we now see the historic district of downtown Charleston, between the two rivers, for to make it easier to defend. And originally it was a fortified, the historic district had a fortified palisade around it, with a lot of these shopping districts in the Battery, just open fields or forest. And if you go to pay a parking ticket over in the federal building, there's still some of this. Archaeologists uncovered some of the original entry gate over there. Sadly, when I do research, I accumulate parking tickets no matter what I do. Downtown Charleston. There's just one more, slightly later in time, 1711 picture of Charlestown as it existed in the colonial era. A palisaded, fortified town. And the other consequence, which you probably saw coming, was the Carolinians got what they wanted. They terminated that relationship, that monopolistic relationship with the Westos, and they initiated new trade relations with lots and lots of southeastern Indian nations. Much more populous than the Westos. The Creek Indians, if they were to gather all of their gunmen, all of their warriors together, could probably have put in the neighborhood of 12 to 1,500 fighters in the field. The Westos, with everyone equipped with guns, would have never stood a chance against a nation like that. They were only feared in the old days because they were the only ones armed. The Chickasaws were way out 500 miles to the west in northern Mississippi. But the Carolinian traders made their way all the way out there and established relations there. The Cherokees up in the mountains and the Catawbas closer to home. And as those trade relations began to be made, I'll show you some of the items that were sold. A lot of the mission Indians, I've got a picture, a map of those missions, Spanish missions. I said, if you were looking at them in the early to mid 1600s, you would think that was the wave of the future. But of course, the Westos and Carolina scuttled that trend. A lot of the mission Indians, hearing about the Carolina trade system, hearing about what you could buy, guns being among the top items that were desired after the Westo experience, a lot of the Spanish mission Indians began abandoning the missions and migrating closer to Carolina to become part of that Carolina trading system. Here are some of the most famous of those migrants, the Yamasees. Probably half of that nation had gone into the Spanish missions, and they were pretty half-hearted about the Christianity. The Spanish friars themselves sometimes listed them. They took their names down, but sometimes listed them, even though they were living there in the mission complex, listed the Yamasees as pagans. They were there just to get the merchandise, I would presume. And about half of the nation was still up in central Georgia. And about 1685, they made a collective decision to head to Carolina. They didn't consult Carolina beforehand, but it looks like Carolina would be a very promising trade partner and ally, and that's what they rolled the dice. They rolled, what is the French saying? They married their destiny to Carolina. They simply showed up. Carolinians were rather stunned to see them. At the mouth of the Savannah River, you're looking at early Savannah. I put the picture up here because it's such a cool picture. But it's called Yamasee Bluff. That name was there before the town of Savannah was there. If you've gone, how many people have gone to Savannah and gone along Factor's Walk? That really, really steep, that's the bluff. That's the bluff you're looking at right there. Yamasee Bluff. About 1,500 Yamasees showed up en masse right there and then moved up into South Carolina. They wanted a piece of that trade action. And They tried a couple of different locations. They went up to the Ashepoo River and then finally down to Port Royal, which is where they were when all hell broke loose in 1715, which we'll talk about in just a second. But the Yamasees became South Carolina's, even though South Carolina was not expecting it, Carolina's most important Indians. Yamasees moved up into Carolina in 1685, and they began trading with the Carolinians really intensively. The Creek trade was extremely important. The Cherokee trade was important, but the Yamasees were the #1 trading partner for about the next 20 years, 1685 to 1715, and then things immediately ended in 1715, as we'll talk about. There were two basic pillars to the Carolina economy: the Indian trade, which is our main subject of the day, and I'll talk a little bit more about in a slide or two, and staple agriculture. A staple is an agricultural export crop. Later on in time, the South was renowned for cotton. This early stage, it was rice. And if you remember that term, tidewater, we were talking about the zones of Carolina. The rice was always grown in the tidewater of Carolina. You're looking at a floodgate. That's the reason why the rice paddy had to be flooded and drained and flooded and drained. So when the river came up within the the tidewater, the tides of the ocean would raise the river. All of these rice plantations were along the coast, where the fluctuations of the river with the tides could flood those rice paddies. And later on in time, Eliza Lucas Pinckney pioneered the indigo trade. And that's a little bit farther ahead of where we are at present. Ready to go forward? So that's just for atmosphere. I think that's Middleton Place. People get married there now because it's so beautiful, and they maybe sometimes give a thought to the unbelievable suffering that went into building those lovely landscapes. But I can't think of anything more miserable than to stand waist deep in water in the hot summer and working in those rice paddies, or gouging out those rice paddies with swarms of mosquitoes. It's absolutely unimaginable what suffering went into the creation of those plantations. Well, let's take a quick look at the Indian trade. And, if you want to, Samantha, do you want to touch some trade items? Yeah. If you don't want to touch any of these, you don't have to. Just wave them on past. But I've brought a few things that were part of the Indian trade. And here is a drawing made by a European observer of some Indians. That's the title of the painting down here, Indians Going A-Hunting. You can see a few of the trade items coming around depicted here. Native Americans acquired some new things: cotton, shirts, wool, blankets, a brass kettle, and of course a flintlock gun. I can't bring my flintlock musket, but I brought a flint, a musket ball, and a flint just for fun. There's a little list of some of the top trade items, things Indians wanted to buy. One of the reasons the Yamasees wanted to be close to Carolina. The glass beads you've got coming around are replicas of trade beads. Those were highly sought after. So if you are an English trader heading out to Indian country, these are a bunch of the things you would have in your possessions. The wool blankets, quite useful. Wool is, I won't spend too much time on it, but a remarkable fabric. You can stand out in the open rain on a cold day if you've got on a wool jacket, and you will feel okay. the water can be pouring out of the wool, and that wool will keep you warm. It's hard to believe until you actually experience it, but it is an amazing fabric. I guess that's why the sheep don't whine and complain so much up there in the Scottish Highlands. Needles, steel knives. The pipe you've got is a KLM trade pipe. It was designed specifically for trade and also for taverns. If you were going through 96, maybe I'll tell this story again when we go through 96. If you're a traveler through 96, 1730s, which is, I think, the first time the word 96 appears on a map, you might stop in at a tavern and they would have some of those clay pipes for you to smoke some tobacco. And what you would typically do to prevent getting COVID-19 is you would snap off the end of the clay pipe. They were that cheap and that plentiful. You would just snap off the end so you would have a fresh little mouthpiece. So they got shorter and shorter and shorter over time. Some of them are only 1.5 feet long. But Native Americans wanted to purchase those KLM trade pipes as well. And in many cases, they used them for jewelry. English traders didn't always anticipate why Native Americans wanted things, but in many cases, they bought the pipes so that they could specifically snap off 1 to 2 inch long lengths, and then the women would string them as necklaces. They're known as trade pipe necklaces. You see those a lot in the archaeological samples. And in some of the artwork. And of course, the guns. There's a typical Indian trade gun. These were often shortened versions of retired British military muskets. Native Americans let it be known, once they started purchasing these things from Carolina, that they didn't want the full length. In the British military, it had to be long enough to stand in formation and project in front of the ear of your front rank to volley fire, but that was too much to carry through the woods for hunting. So Native Americans requested that these guns be about 1 foot shorter. So a trade gun is a unique modification of a British military musket with a flintlock. These are muzzle loaders. You guys want me to say something about muzzle loaders? I see one person saying yes. Even if you say no today, I'll probably say it again out at 96. But these are muskets in which you pour your powder, black powder, in the top, and this is your ramrod. You pack your powder and your ball down. You've got a round musket ball that was a typical caliber during the Revolutionary period. Pack it all down, pull back your cock, and it has the flint. There. Pull the trigger, the flint lurches forward. You put a little powder in your pan, lurches forward, creates a spark. So it's a pretty noisy type of weapon. Creates a spark that goes through the touch hole to the barrel and shoots the bullet. So those were extremely popular. It took about 1 winter's hunting to buy one. So usually about 35 to 40 deer skins, which is probably on the low range for a really good hunter. A really good hunter might get more than that, but on average, it was the bulk. Most of what you did over the winter hunting white-tailed deer would pay for one gun. So this is what they were selling. You guys don't even watch that film anymore, do you? Yeah. My mom had to leave the theater when I was 5 years old. I had a breakdown when his mom was killed. Started bawling. Well, poor Bambi was one of the primary targets. Because the deer skins could be used for lots of things. If you go into an archive, go to the Oxford or Cambridge archives and get a book from the 1720s, 1730s, it's a leather-bound book, and you're probably holding a book that is bound by a Carolina deer, because Carolina was providing the lion's share of the leather that was crafted for books, gloves. I have deleted some of my Captain Jack Sparrow Disney images for the sake of efficiency today. But if you remember Captain Barbossa and the Pirates of the Caribbean, that's a Carolina hat. Not only the leather, but the style became synonymous with Carolina. Everybody in London knew it was coming, the leather was coming from Carolina, and it supplanted some of the older Cavalier styles of headgear. But if you watch Captain Barbossa, in some cases he's got one side up, others he's got it down. It's a really great hat for rainy London because that leather, broad-brimmed leather, channels all the rain over your shoulders away from your neck, and you stay dry for the most part. And Captain Jack Sparrow is he's depicted with a leather tricorn hat. Those corners can be brought down it makes it a Carolina hat as well. And over here, can you guess what the commodity is here? You've got a Native American woman scraping the meat and the sinews from a deer hide. Native American women participated in the trade by preparing the deer skins for exchange. English traders didn't want to buy the raw thing with blood and stuff hanging off of it because it would rot before they could get it back to the ship. So Native American women prepared things. She's preparing a deer skin. She's got one stretched over a box drying here. Last chance to identify the product.
Looks like rice or sugar.
Well, you've got some brandy, probably. The English like to sell rum. The French in Louisiana sold brandy. And this happens to be a little farther west. These are some Indians in the French sphere. But there they are. These guys over here, if you look closely at their faces, are painted for war. They have the typical southeastern Muskogean war paint combination was red and black in different patterns on the face. Red for the blood of your enemies and black for death without mercy. It's war paint. They're coming back from aid. They're painted for war. They don't walk around in civilian life painted for war. They're coming back from a raid. If you look closely, this woman's face is red on the side. That's not war paint. That's a wound. She's hurt. And she's holding hands with a little boy. He's also got something, little children were not painted for war. He's got an injury on his face of some sort, and he's looking up at his mom as if to ask, is everything okay? And of course, no, everything is not okay at all, and they have been captured in a raid. The Westos taught southeastern Indians how to do it, and it spread. 35 to 40 deer skins, or one lucky strike. One Indian slave would buy you a gun. So you can either do this all winter, November, December, maybe part of January, or you can go on a 1 week raid and you can be set. So the slave trade had a real attraction, a way to really score a quick turnaround. And it was quite prevalent in the Southeast. All of those Indian nations, Yamasees foremost among them. The Yamasees became the foremost slave raiders in the South, in part because they knew where all of those Spanish missions were. The Yamasees, some of them had lived in the Spanish missions. They knew exactly where they were, and they knew they didn't have guns. So the Yamasees came up to South Carolina, got their guns, and they went back over and over and over and over. Indian slaves, that's the product there. Yeah.
There's a healthy person there too.
Yeah, in this image, there's probably some lost story there. This happened in Carolina quite a bit as well. Once slavery began to, rice became a major crop in the 1690s, and African slaves began to show up, working alongside a minority component of Indian slaves as well. But African slaves ran away, and they were incorporated into Native American tribes. This is possibly what you're seeing right here, a boy who is headed up into the upcountry of Louisiana, and he's no longer taking orders. That's my guess. The artist didn't record. He recorded what he saw. He didn't record exactly what's going on with that young man. But that's my guess, what's going on there. The Indian slave trade. One historian has estimated that while it was taking place, that Indian slave trade all across the South, brought into Charleston and exported from Charleston as much as 50,000 Native Americans. That's just for export. Export to sugar colonies in the Caribbean. Many of them were sent northward to New England colonies. And a number were put to work in Carolina. Carolina rice planters were desperate to buy African slaves that were desperate to buy Native American slaves to work on those rice paddies, to stand in the water amongst all the swarms of mosquitoes. The image I put over here as a curiosity, because even though the guns were an essential part of intertribal warfare by the early 1700s, they kept the bows and arrows because when they went down to those missions, the mission Indians were living in thatched houses, and they could dip the head of the arrow in tar, set it on fire. And that's the start of a slave raid. And at the very beginning, prior to dawn, they would fire those burning arrows into the roofs, and the mission Indians would run out. And at that point, they would begin targeting who they wanted to kill or capture for the slave raid. This one is also obscured slightly by my haircut, but the date there is 1704. James Moore, governor of South Carolina, led one of those slave raids, one of the largest on the Spanish missions. About 2,000 Indian warriors followed him down to northern Florida, and they just wailed on the Spanish missions so badly that the remaining missions, surviving missions, after one major battle, gave up. The mission Indians just said, take us where you want to take us. Yes, sir.
When for Europeans in contact with the Indians, the diseases was a major concern. At least looking back, was this, since they've had so much contact by now, are they kind of have immunity to these diseases?
Great question. The question is, at this point, were Native Americans beginning to acquire some immunities, or were diseases still a major issue? And no, they had not yet acquired any significant level of immunity or antibodies to these diseases. So that was still in play. In fact, white settlers to Carolina had an awful time as well. Smallpox, yellow fever, it was known as the seasoning. It was a very unhealthy colony. And smallpox was running through all of these Native American populations as we show these slides. So that too was a devastating element. So accelerated intertribal warfare as a result of the Indian slave trade and continuing epidemics. So it was an awful time to be Native American in that mix of unpleasant things. But no, smallpox was still there and still just as deadly, and it caused problems in Carolina as well. Well, it's hidden a little bit by my image there, but it's what you anticipated, the collapse of the Spanish mission system. It simply could not stand it any longer. By 1704, 1705, it was just done for. The missions, Indians, if some of them still were committed to Christianity, they knew they couldn't stay there because the Yamasees would be showing up to take captives. So most of them, if they wanted to remain in the Spanish alliance system, retreated back towards St. Augustine, and all of those little chapels that had once dotted the landscape were abandoned. Don't write this down. This is from my book. This is one of my great achievements. I spent a summer in the South Carolina archives going through the wills and probate records to come up with a statistical study of Indian slavery, and it boils down to basically just one table in my book, one page. But that's one of my great contributions. That's the high point prior to the war, 1720s, once the slave trade was wiped out. The Indian population working on rice plantations and other plantations in Carolina was beginning to decline down to about 1,000 to 1,200 individuals, men, women, and children. So destruction of the mission system. And let me set up a quick exercise for you. All of that. We've mentioned two factors that would have been destabilizing in any period. The Indian slave trade, lots of military conflict, disease, but doing business with Carolina was an unusual activity for a lot of Americans that were not used to haggling for prices. English traders didn't think very much about it, but there was a lot that could result in resentment. You know, if your neighbor got a better deal on a musket than you did, then you bore some animus towards that English trader, suspected him of, not dealing right with you. They didn't have a sense of the supply and demand that was shaping the prices of these products. Native Americans had never experienced credit before. English traders thought they were extending credit. Native Americans thought in some cases they were receiving a gift from a friend, as was customary among allies. So there were lots of things that led to tensions, and the Carolinians created a system to try and take care of that. It was manned by an Indian agent. This is the crux of the story, as I tell it, about the Yamasee War. They created the position, the office of Indian agent, one man who was the colony's representative to go out and talk to the Yamasees if they were upset, talk to the Cherokees if they were upset, hear their complaints, and try to do something to maintain the alliance. They established that office around 1707, and only two men ever held it. I'm going to write their names out. John Wright Thomas Nairn. John Wright was Indian agent for a year or two. Then he was fired, and Thomas Nairn was made Indian agent. Then John Wright got it back again. The two guys hated each other. John Wright especially began to resent being fired, in part because Thomas Nairn, as Indian agent, stopped him from doing some business deals that he wanted to do. Thomas Nairn was the Indian agent in April 1715, when the Yamasees were rumored to be so angry with Carolina that they were ready to go to war. So Carolina, sensing that diplomacy was needed, sent a negotiating team to the main town of Pocataligo, the main Yamasee town of Pocataligo, This is as close as I can get to where I thought it was at the time. Archaeologists have since discovered the actual town and done some excavating. But I'm standing in some rushes off of the highway there. That's pretty darn close to where it happened. For some reason, South Carolina sent both John Wright and Thomas Nairn to talk to the Yamasees. Thomas Nairn, as the official Indian agent, told them that Carolina valued their friendship and would take their concerns into consideration. And they shook hands that night, and everybody went to bed. The following morning, a Good Friday, April 15th, the Yamasees stormed into the council house where Nairn and Wright and the rest of them were sleeping, and they began killing everybody. They kept Nairn alive for about 3 days to torture him, and then the war parties moved out. Down to Port Royal, there's some modern interstates, you can ignore those. Beaufort was the main town there. Killing white settlers wherever they could find them. It's the beginning of what's known as the Yamasee War. I'm not going to have a whole lot of time to think about this document, but I'm going to go ahead and set it up, and if you need to, you can take it with you and bring it back next time, but this is our exercise for the day. The Yamasee War broke out 1715. Initially the Yamasees, but then the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Catawbas got in, almost every Indian nation in the South, and almost wiped out South Carolina. But here is the issue. After this first battle with South Carolina, skip over a little bit of this. I've already talked about that. There's Nairn and Wright. After that very first battle, a note was discovered on one of the dead Yamasee warriors addressed to Governor Charles Craven of South Carolina, explaining why the Yamasees had started the war. And I was writing my book on the Yamasee War. That letter was legendary. It's in all the accounts of the early Yamasee War. They found the letter, and then it disappeared from history. Charles Craven mentioned it, that the Yamasees had written a letter to him, and then it disappeared from history. Well, I stumbled across the lost Yamasee letter about 2002 up in Raleigh, North Carolina. The original is in the British Museum, the British Archives, National Archives. But your exercise is take a look at that lost Yamasee letter, what the Yamasees actually said, and think about some possible reasons. Historians had always thought, before I found Yamasees shook hands with Thomas Nairn only to lull him into a sense of security, because they had already decided to kill it, already decided to go to war. Yeah. I'm still making my way around talking. You may not have time to fully finish it today. But based on this letter, how might this alter that traditional view that the Yamasees were already committed to war with South Carolina? Does that make sense? You're welcome to talk to a friend. But in the end, I need your own name on the worksheet. And like I said, if you've got to run, you can bring it in. Debate.
Yeah.